Initiatives Officer for the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and in that role, I try to help other states and the federal government be more like Texas, the good parts of Texas, of course. We do things like sue the federal government. Isn't that fun when you think about it? Suing the federal government, trying to force them, horrors upon horrors, to actually follow the Constitution. Yes. Well, it's a pleasure to have one of my favorite authors, who is no stranger to this forum, Larry Schweikart, who is a very prolific author and a professor. Larry is the author of 25 books, including the New York Times #1 bestseller, A Patriot's History of the United States, as well as today's new book featured A Patriot's History of Globalism, which is a fascinating topic. He graduated from Arizona State University with a Bachelor of Political Science, an MA in History, and then got his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. I can think of worse places to go to school, you know, as long as you're not distracted by the surfing.
It's the fog.
The fog is prevalent there. He taught at the University of Dayton from 1985 to 2016, and throughout his career, has taught at every grade from 7th grade through college. He's been on a lot of different media, from Al Jazeera to Glenn Beck, from Travis Smiley to Rush Limbaugh. Boy, we miss him. Schweikart has been a film producer since 2009. We featured one of his documentaries here called Rockin' the Wall, and that documentary that was featured on PBS was about how American rock and roll actually helped stimulate the downfall of the Soviet Union. So when you think about it, maybe some of the critics here in America about, you know, the criticisms about rock and roll being corrosive, maybe they were right, but it maybe corroded things that they weren't expecting. He also founded the Wild World of History curriculum website in 2019. Let's get on with today's topic, which, of course, afterwards, for those of you who are interested, you can buy a copy of the book and probably even get an autograph by the author.
The book's free, but my autograph's $25.
Yeah. See, I do it differently. When I sell my books, I say that the book is whatever the price, let's say $15, but if you don't want an autograph, it's more, because it hurts my feelings if you don't want the autograph.
At the last homeschool convention, my next door neighbor had a sign, "Get the Biden discount, add 20%.
That's right. Yes, right. Why not 20% for the big guy over here, Larry Schweikart? So let's talk about your book. So to me, one of the interesting things about globalism is it's a term that means a lot of different things to a lot of people. You'll hear in the current political context the term globalism used pejoratively. You'll hear it used with things like, well, he's a neocon, right? When you think of globalism, and this is the history of globalism, you actually go back pretty far. Tell us about the origins of what you see as the origins of globalism, and why that's relevant for today.
Yeah, I go back to the future. I start with the Congress of Vienna, because the Congress of Vienna was our first real attempt at globalism, which I define as an attempt by elites to rule the masses without regard to national boundaries or nationalism or ethnicity. That's really what kind of makes it different. And certainly there's many aspects of globalism that are wonderful. We all like being able to buy products from abroad, to talk to people in different countries. But we're talking about these efforts by elites at control. And really the first time they attempted this was at the Congress of Vienna, and they wanted to restructure Europe. Now, you got to remember, to them, Europe was the globe, okay? There was nothing outside of Europe to these guys. So they were going to restructure the globe in terms of their power. They wanted to make sure there was never another Napoleon that came along, to prevent war and to just make people's lives better. Supposedly, that's what they were going to do. But, of course, once they got started, things evolved quite differently. They missed the major revolution going on right under their eyes, which was the popular revolution, of which started in America, then France. Many others were bubbling up, and they totally ignored that. So I have a quotation here from Friedrich Gentz. Gentz was Count Metternich's #2. Now, Gentz, Metternich, of course, ran the Congress of Vienna. He was the most powerful figure there. Here's how Gentz explained it. Never have the expectations of the general public been as excited as they were before the opening of this solemn assembly. People were confident of a general reform of the political system of Europe, of a guarantee of eternal peace, even of a return of the golden age, yet it produced only restitutions decided beforehand by force of arms, arrangements between the great powers unfavorable to the future balance and maintenance of the people of Europe. So even one of the participants realized we kind of pulled the wool over people's eyes. We're not doing what they thought we were doing at all.
Tell me a bit about the conference. So Metternich, just for the audience, who was Metternich? So he worked for the Austrian government, right?
Right. Count Metternich is largely held to be one of the best diplomats in Europe at this time. Henry Kissinger just loved this guy. Next to Napoleon, though, who had a great spy network, any spy network can be great, let's say a powerful spy network, Metternich probably had the most formidable spy network in all of Europe. He had spies in every single embassy alongside the ambassadors. And of course, when they held the delegation in Austria, when they had this great meeting, he employed hundreds of ladies of the night who had two jobs. One was obvious, but the other was to be spies and to report daily back to Metternich as to what was going on with their assignations.
And you also had a menu from the Congress of Vienna, just for sake of helping us to understand kind of the level of eliteness, because some things never change, do they?
No, and you see the same thing at Davos. So at the Grand Ball, the festival for the members included 300 hams, 200 partridges, 200 pigeons, 150 pheasants, 60 hares, 40 rabbits, 20 large turkeys, 12 boars, plus roasted and cold meat, 600 pickled tongues, side dishes including 3,000 liters of soups, 2,500 biscuits, 1,000 oval-shaped pastries, 600 sponge cakes, finished off by pies, pastries, almonds, and French puff pastries, all washed down by thousands of gallons of almond milk, lemonade, tea, and of course, wine, better known to you as breakfast at Lizzo's.
Wow. And it's interesting, the detail, because I'm guessing that this was probably in some government expense report, which is why we know the details of this menu. So walk us through the various episodes. So the way you've organized your book is you start at the Congress of Vienna, but then you have different types of globalism that you seek to give kind of the origins and the history and how they are different or connected together. So could you walk us through the different aspects of globalism that your research uncovers? Yeah,
and the interesting thing is they all fail. They all failed, but they each failed for a different reason. So Congress of Vienna was diplomatic, was a monarchical globalism, as done by almost all monarchs. No, Metternich was the only one who wasn't a monarch there. Then you get to militaristic globalism, which took place from about 1860 to 1900, when most of the European countries began conquering large parts of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and of course they did this because they're higher levels of technology and because they could keep the natives kind of pitted against each other. They supported that largely with missionaries. And there were armies of missionaries that followed these armies into the field to kind of placate the natives. That began to peter out as various people started to demand independence. And it gave way after World War I to diplomatic globalism led by our favorite guy, Woodrow Wilson. And literally, this time they were moving around map lines that involved millions of people being forced into different countries that were not their own. Poles into Germany, Germans into Austria, Austrians into Czechoslovakia, and so on and so forth. After that, and after World War II, the United Nations gave us two different types of globalism. Both of them really kind of started before the war's end. The first was scientific globalism that came when a group of the nuclear scientists, I'm sure you kind of saw Oppenheimer, you kind of know what I'm talking about here, these scientists believed they were, well, smarter than everybody else. And they should run the world because they were smarter and they helped design the atomic bomb. And we can't trust the atomic bomb to people or politicians, so we got to control it. Niels Bohr had even started a secret society called the Bund before the war and hoped to have the Bund run things after the war. This had a great deal of popularity for a very short time, about 6 months. And then Uncle Joe Stalin began to get a little frisky, taking over different nations and starting to kill people out in the open. And the American public suddenly decided, you know, maybe it's best we not share nuclear weapons with the rest of the world. Maybe we ought to hang on to our own. The second aspect that came out of the UN's time was financial globalism, which is really still with us. It's starting to unravel now. If you've read books like The Accidental Superpower, this shows that the Breton Woods Agreement that was set up during the war has lasted almost 60, 70 years. Now, Breton Woods, of course, isn't even really a town. It's a hotel in New Hampshire. The delegates, so many people descended on it, they had to get the local Boy Scouts to help out in the service areas because they just didn't have enough service people. The hotel manager went so nuts with all this, he locked himself in his office with a case of whiskey and didn't come out again till it was all done. But anyway, the financial globalism gave us 3 main points from Breton Woods. One, the world's economy would be tied to the dollar. Number 2, the world, except for the communist world, would accept free trade. Now, the free trade aspect was to be backed up by the U.S. Navy, specifically, and by the U.S. military more broadly. And then the third aspect was they set up the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Both of those were to lend money to so-called developing nations. Well, they were funded largely by the United States. Not entirely, but largely by the United States. So that point, number 3, funding the rest of the world to develop, ran counter to number 1, which was maintain a strong dollar. The dollar is not going to be an international unit of exchange if it's weak, if nobody wants it. So this was known as Triffin's dilemma, and it has kind of plagued that aspect of Bretton Woods ever since. But as I said, it's still with us, but it's just now starting to wind down, mainly because the U.S. public is tired of fronting long overseas wars and giant militaries and so on. Most of you lived through the last 2, which was medical globalism and the China virus vax with our pal Dr. Fauci. And that was an attempt, and this, folks, they came this close. They were this close to establishing global international control using these protocols. You've got to get a vax, you've got to wear a mask, you've got to stand 6 feet apart, you've got to lock down. Every nation in the world except Sweden and a few African nations locked down.
Isn't that still, though, kind of bubbling out there? My understanding is that the World Health Organization has been working on some regulations that, if adopted, could potentially go a long ways toward erasing national and state sovereignty.
Yeah, and that's the WHO. And don't get them confused with the good WHO. Pete Townsend, the good WHO. You know, when I was in the rock band, we played at the Troubadour, and the WHO came in and sat, we're playing here, and they sat right where those 2 guys are. And they sat through our whole set. And when we were done, Pete Townsend got up, slapped me on the back, say, "Hey, good show, Watt." Well, he was so drunk, he wouldn't have known what we played. But
No, you don't have to say that part. You only have to say that Pete Townsend said good show to you after you were done.
So that's the good WHO.
Yeah, okay.
The bad WHO does have this list of policies they want to impose on everybody. It's not flying. They had to backtrack on their first set of policies because of the pushback. Second of all, they can't get it through the U.S. Senate, even with as many kind of big government types as we have there. So
all right. That's medical, but you had another one that you were.
And then the last one, of course, is climate change globalism, using celebrities as kind of their spokespeople. And I go into a long analysis, not my analysis, but other people's analysis of what is the impact of a celebrity. How far do people follow celebrities in terms of buying products and stuff? And this one interesting point kind of came out. Leonardo DiCaprio did a movie about climate change. And
now, wasn't that the movie that was partially funded by a country in the Middle East?
Well, yeah.
Okay. No, all right. Sorry. It sounds like I'm stepping on your punchline there, so pardon me.
No. But the interesting thing is that he realized that people would tune in to watch him, but as soon as he started talking about science and what was happening with data and so forth, they tune him out because he's an airhead. So they had to bring in scientists to actually handle the scientific data part, but when the scientists started talking, everybody tuned out because they were boring. So it was kind of a catch-22. Anyway, there's some really interesting literature out there on how much these kinds of people can actually sell us stuff.
I've always been fascinated with the whole climate change, grift, if you will, in that it's like the answer is always global socialism, right? And when you say, well, gee, if this is really a problem, why aren't we building one nuclear power plant every week? And it's like, well, no. We can't have that because what I really want is to control your economic decisions. And it's like, oh, why didn't you just say so? Come on now.
Well, the last chapter of the book is kind of, I call this book part history and part hope. The last chapter of the book is how globalism is in decline. Notice the title is not Rise and Fall of Globalism, and they haven't been kicked out yet. But it is in decline, and with the exception of the French and English elections, which had very specific reasons for going the way they did, the trend of almost all the European elections is against globalism, whether it's Slovakia, Estonia, Portugal, Hungary, over in Argentina, there were Netherlands, dozens and dozens of elections about 4 or 5 months ago, and they were all trending in the more populist, less globalist direction. And of course, there's all sorts of other reasons I think you can have hope, whether it's from medical to climate change, as you mentioned.
So let's talk a little bit, playing off your title, A Patriot's History of Globalism. I've been fascinated over the years with studies, basically polling data, that looks at the attitudes of different sets of people, whether in the United States or in other countries. And specifically, if you look at, for example, a lot of our executive class or people within Hollywood or within Silicon Valley, you'll find that they view their counterparts in other countries as really their peers, the people that they have the most in common with, as opposed to, let's say, the American who built their house or the guy who came in and repaired their plumbing, right? Is that part of your book? Have you looked at that? I mean, what's going on with that, where you have people who, I suppose it's not too dissimilar if you go back and you look at European history before kind of the advent of the Westphalian state. You would see people who would maybe be born in Scotland. I'm think of like John Paul Jones, right? So he
not the bass player for Led Zeppelin.
Right. Okay. No, you're insufferable.
Just wanted to make sure. Got to stay on the same page here.
Yeah. No, you'd see these guys though that of merit and talent who would work for all these different kings in countries that they weren't born in, right? So maybe this is not that new of a phenomena, but what's that all about?
Well, I'm 73, and I go back to a time in Chandler, Arizona, which was 12,000 people when I grew up, and we were definitely middle class to lower middle class. My dad was a ranch manager. He was a cowboy. I'm telling you, he engaged in calf roping and dehorning steers and the whole business. But right diagonally across from us, I literally could walk across the street to their house, was the Bogle family, one of the richest families in all of Chandler. There were no walls separating them. I would go swimming over at their house. They'd invite me over to swim, right? And right behind us were the Barneses, and they weren't quite as rich as the Bogles, but they were fairly rich. But the other direction from us were some fairly poor people. We were all within a 2-block radius. We went to church together. We went to the same social activities together. Certainly, we all went to the same high school together. And so that has largely changed, and now you have a situation, and nobody talks about this better than Charles Murray. Murray is the king of this in terms of he laid out a situation where if you're in parts of Washington, D.C., and you have someone else pick up your dry cleaning or get your coffee, you will never interact with anyone who hasn't gone to an Ivy League school and who doesn't have an income above about $500,000 or $600,000. Won't even talk to somebody, let alone have them as your friends. And he has this great, I don't know if you've seen his bubble test. Have any of you seen his bubble test?
I had, yes. Many of us had. A number of years ago, I actually had most of the foundation take the bubble test because what I wanted to test was a theory, right? And let me say very briefly, the people who worked at this think tank actually were pretty center mass as far as being typical Americans. And the reason why I thought it was important to take is if you look at a lot of the Washington, D.C. think tanks that purport to be national think tanks, right, national think tanks, and you look at their key staff, what you find is a huge amount of their key staff comes from Ivy League institutions. And I'm thinking, how in the heck can you claim to be a national think tank when everyone making policy decisions comes from the Acela corridor from Washington, D.C. to Boston and all went to the same schools? That's not national, that's regional, right? So that's, yes, many of us are familiar with the bubble test.
And it should be updated. I don't know if he could update it or if somebody else could update it, because a lot of his questions had to do with popular culture,
Right.
like television, which of course has declined for a lot of reasons because you're all watching, iPads and your phones and everything else, and you're not really watching television as we used to have it. But nevertheless, his bubble test was amazing. He'd say, do you have any friends who are smokers? And that's just, and there's like, I don't know, today maybe 30% of the American population smokes, something like that. And yet, how many of you know a smoker? Or how many of you worked a day in your life where you hurt everywhere when you went home at night, right? And I can remember that. I worked pulling up hay bales for my dad onto the trailer in Arizona when it's 110, and those hay bales are not light.
Another question was military. Have you served in the military, or do you know what a rank is? I think, right? So,
and I'd put those ranks, sergeant, major, general, all the insignias up there for my students, and how many of you can name these? And we were in a military city because Dayton, Ohio had Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Yeah. And even then, a lot of the students, I had one girl that scored literally a 0 on the bubble test. She was in a total bubble. She can get one question outside the bubble.
So the bubble test essentially looks at how insulated you are from the center mass of America, the average American, like NASCAR and things like that, right? Or are you comfortable in an Ivy League school or in downtown New York City or something like that, right?
Well, but it goes further than that. When you look in the medical chapter, for example, how did we get where we got? Well, how we got where we got was because so many medical professionals who had contradictory ideas were cut out right at the beginning of all of the discussions. People like John Ioannidis and Scott Atlas and people like that. And Ioannidis, I think it was Atlas who said, well, I didn't press harder because I thought this is so ridiculous. Everybody's going to say, just come on, stop. Really? Wearing a mask is going to protect you against a virus? And he said, and then it kept going and going and going until it was really too late that a lot of these people couldn't get involved because by the time they tried to get involved, they were actually being censored and blacklisted.
Right. I mean, that was a real time. I was one of the point people for the foundation in trying to gather information about COVID and kind of pushing back. And I remember very distinctly one time as I was posting something that people within that orbit countered and said that because of the things I was saying, I should be in prison.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, well, that escalated quickly. Okay, well.
And even that great Democrat, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., said that people who disagree with climate change should be in jail. So, I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, that's very, very dangerous stuff when you get to that point.
Right. So why is globalism beginning to retreat? What's going on? I know you talked about the elections around the world where you're generally seeing a trend towards a reassertion of national sovereignty. What's that look like? How's that process continue? And what's the likelihood of there being successful pushback?
Well, I think we saw the first inkling of change when George Soros pulled his organization out of Europe 2 years ago. That was That was big. And then last year, the WEF, the most recent meeting, I guess that was, February or so, the WEF, nobody of any importance came. No major prime ministers, presidents, whatnot. The only one who attended was Javier Milei of Argentina, and he came so he could read them the Riot Act. He said, "You're all a bunch of socialists here." I go, "Yeah, way to go." But what's even more important...
Did he bring his chainsaw?
Yeah. Pluck those things right off the whiteboard. He also went so far at this event, they had their theme. And their theme was restoring trust. Now, you know you're in the hole when your theme has to be restoring trust. You're done, right? And so that was big. The vax. One study shows that 82% of the Americans took the first vax. 50% took a second one. Now only about 1 or 2% are willing to take another vax. I think that's major, because they were this close to having everybody locked down taking the vax.
Right.
And our friend Noah Yuval Harari, who's known as the prophet, I call him the false prophet, but the prophet of the WEF, said that the year 2020 was the year that man agreed to be surveyed under the skin. Now, if you know the book of Revelation, the hairs on the back of your neck are just standing up right about then.
Wow. Yeah, that's apocalyptic stuff there. So, what replaces this, right? If globalism collapses eventually, what's the world look like? How are things different?
Well, we will return to more of a nationalistic-driven world. Nations will be more in charge. People will be more in charge of their own nations, more in charge of their own medicine. It's interesting. Richard Barris, who is by far the best pollster in America, conducted a poll about 3 or 4 weeks ago on the 4 freedoms: food freedom, financial freedom, speech freedom, and medical freedom. And the poll numbers, and he's a good pollster. He knows how to, you were talking about polls earlier. It's very important that you word polls with an alternative, because if you just say, "Do you hate Whoopi Goldberg?" Yeah, heck yes, right? But you've got to have an alternative. So he knows how to do these polls. He found way over 50%, usually closer to 60% of those he surveyed were in favor of food freedom in terms of being able to go buy your food from a local farmer without having government regulation over it. Medical freedom, however you spell it out, vast, large majorities are in favor of that stuff. So they are winning issues here, and anybody who attaches themselves, I think, to those is going to be in good shape. And that goes for your local Texas candidates here. You run on food freedom, financial freedom, that is, digital Bitcoin not controlled by the government.
Right.
Medical freedom, being able to have your own medical records and that kind of stuff. Refuse a vax. Doctor says, "You need the vax." You say, "No." That's it. That's where it should end.
So you talk about digital currency not controlled by the government. Is there what's the connection between globalism and the drive for that sort of control and this phenomena that we've learned about in some of us cases just recently, this debanking phenomena, right? Are those connected?
Oh, it's huge. One of my friends, Steve Olds, runs an operation called Patriot Mission that is really aimed at veterans. And 2 years ago, he had all of his accounts frozen because the name Patriot was in the account. So we're seeing this more and more. Well, they can't get at you if you got, a form of Bitcoin, if you've got things that aren't beholden to the banks. And hey, I'm a banking historian. I like banks, I trace the history of banks throughout this country. But I think that there is a concern that globalists would do what they're doing in China, which is impose these kind of social credit scores. So now you're going to have to do whatever the government tells you, or you don't get to go visit grandma in the next town.
Right. So what kind of arguments can be mustered against your narrative? In other words, there's got to be some claim of goodness, right? What are they going to say, setting apart the WAF or Soros or whomever? If you look at, for example, your standard issue Ivy League Foreign Service officer who's already put 20 years in the State Department and believes in, the international community and international law, how would they push back? Legitimately, in other words, don't make a straw man, but how would they claim that they have something that's worth kind of maintaining?
I think first they would say, well, look at Putin. Putin is going crazy there, and there's no international pushback to stop him, right? The argument would be that individual nations would grow powerful and nationalistic and would seek control over other nations, which is almost what NATO is trying to do in Europe, except as a group instead of one nation. So I think one of the areas there is they would say, well, what about world peace? And I call your attention back to my friends at the Congress of Vienna. They wanted to establish world peace after Napoleon, peace in Europe. Well, what do you have in the 50 years after Napoleon with the Congress of Vienna? You had the Crimean War, which pitted two of the former three allies against each other, and you had the Franco-Prussian War that pitted Germany and France against each other. And Kissinger calls that a success. Two major wars in 70 years. Oh, yeah, we're keeping the peace. Sort of like what the international order did with Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan and Syria and on and on and on. There ain't a whole lot of peace there. You guys are all too young to remember this, but we had a TV show growing up called The Rifleman with Chuck Connors. And the Rifleman had this really interesting Winchester that had a big round thing that he could flip around like that, and he would make it into a machine gun almost. And Mad Magazine did a parody on this because every week a different person would come to town and disturb Chuck Connor's peace. And he'd have to kill him. So they did a parody on this where the mailman's coming, Lucas McCain, I got your mail. You're disturbing my peace. Well, that's where we are with the international bodies. You're disturbing our peace, so we got to go to war to stop you from disturbing our peace.
I never expected that Chuck Connors and the Rifleman would be brought into the conversation.
I love that
show. So if you look at
Bonanza is just Yellowstone with different characters.
That's right. That's right. So if you look at individuals who we would consider part of the elite or their kind of their sensibilities as far as how government should run, what is the connection? Tell me if there is a connection. I'm suspecting there may be between the beginnings of the intellectual progressive movement, the German school in the 1870s and the kind of the creation of the concept of a PhD, and then the critique of the Constitution, that the Constitution was obsolete. It wasn't up for the task of a industrial society that was made by people who were agrarian, and that the final critique with Woodrow Wilson that applying Darwinistic concepts, right? You could never have in the natural world an organism that had bodies set up against each other, right? That such an organism could not survive because that's not efficient, right? So is there a connection between those people who would believe that government and rule is too important to be left to the people and their elected representatives and needs to be done by professionals and highly trained technicians, and globalism? Is that basically a different side of the same coin?
Yeah, that's the dividing point. Bill Buckley used to always say he would rather be governed by the first 500 names in the Boston phone book than by the faculty of Harvard. And I think you see a lot of that today. The elites all believe that they're smarter because they've been to these Ivy League schools. And by the way, as a professor, many years I led search committees. I probably led 5 or 6 search committees in my time at the University of Dayton. And we would go to New York and we would invite people based on their resumes that they sent us. And we would always get excited when we see somebody from Harvard or Yale or Princeton. Oh, they're from Yale. And so we'd get them in there and we'd interview them, and they'd be boobs. I mean, they'd be fools. They couldn't answer a simple question. They couldn't explain to you how their research affected anything else beyond their little bubble, right? And I mean, it was just insane. We never once even got one of those people to campus for an interview. They never made it out of the main interview of the first selection because they just weren't that smart. They were there for the connections. That's what Yale and Princeton and Stanford all do for you, is they're a connection school. They aren't there to train you to be brilliant. They're there to train you to get connections.
Wow. Well, okay. Well, I don't think we have a lot of Ivy Leaguers here, but I don't know.
I'll insult you some more. Come again, and I shall insult you a second time.
Excellent. So, getting back to your book, as you did the research, was there anything that surprised you? How many aha moments did you have? Was there anything in it that you didn't already expect and you were just confirming your biases? For example, I thought the whole thing with Metternich and the massive army of prostitutes he employed was that was shocking to me.
That was fun. I enjoyed that part. I think what surprised me the most, and I get into this in the last chapter, is the spiritual element of all of this. And you may think that many of the symbols that they adopt and that they use are just accidental. And I would suggest otherwise. They have too many of these things to just be accidental. For example, outside the Hadron Super Collider at CERN, they have Shiva, the goddess of death. Okay, they opened the Gotthard Tunnel. I urge you all to look this up on YouTube. Gotthard, the grand opening of the Gotthard Tunnel, which has been defined, by the way, as a portal. Anyway, the grand opening of the Gotthard Tunnel is so paganistic, it was shocking. They have all of these people coming out trying to scale this screen that appears to have a mountain on it, but the mountain turns into a giant eyeball. And then a big goat god comes out. Literally, a guy that looks like a goat god. And these 50 women in white, virgins, come out, and he selects one of them to have simulated sex with. Now, this is to open a tunnel? Really? This is not by accident. Look at the statue they have outside the courthouse in New York City where they tried President Trump. Supposedly, it was dedicated to Ruth Buzzy Ginsburg. But in fact, it was Medusa. It was a golden statue with snakes coming out of her head. These are not adopted by accident. They don't happen to have this. And so, let's go back to the Congress of Vienna. What did they have? Same exact things. All sorts of statues of Ares and Pluto and Mars and all of these Greek and Roman gods and all of these kind of pagan ceremonies to celebrate peace? What were they celebrating exactly? So that was the most startling thing, was the symbolism and the really paganism of these people.
That's fascinating. I'm dumbstruck to think of what Medusa has to do with justice. So really the statue outside of was it specifically there to be twinned with the courthouse?
The reasoning behind it was they wanted to put up an honorary statue of Ruth Ginsburg, but they made her look like Medusa. Now, I would have chosen Hillary for that statue, but anyway.
So it's just interesting you talk about the symbols, because I know that, for example, in California, there had been a push to remove some of the Christian heritage from some of the names in various monuments or even symbols. So, for example, I think it was the county of Los Angeles had the three crosses that you can see. Maybe this is the city of Los Angeles. The three crosses that you see above the Hollywood Bowl. So you actually see them. They're on private land, right? Those were removed because you can't have crosses.
Right.
And then there was a goddess, and I think the goddess stayed because the goddess was pagan. So the goddess got to stay because she wasn't Christian. She was a pagan goddess. And then there was another that was the Mission of Los Angeles, right? And I think that had a cross, and that had to go, right? So I guess, these symbols are pretty important to some people.
And, we're into a big tearing down of statues era. But, the one statue that seems to have remained is a statue to Karl Marx up in Seattle. That one's okay.
Well, that is privately owned. It's just to,
Like the crosses.
Yeah, as I recall, it was purchased by some diehard Washington State Marxist who got it at a fire sale price as the Soviet Union had their going out of business sale.
You know where he's buried, right?
Marx.
In a cemetery in London, and he's not buried too far away from Michael Faraday, who invented the electric dynamo. Now, you're sitting here right now thanks to what Michael Faraday did. He's giving you light, he's giving you air conditioning, he's giving you all sorts of wonderful stuff, giving us a clock saying we're out of time, okay? And Marx gave us what? Nothing. Gave us millions and millions and millions of deaths. Yet Faraday has this very simple grave that nobody would notice, and there's this giant bust of that idiot Marx.
Well, there you go. So it's time for some questions. And so what we'd like to do, for those of you who aren't practiced in the way we do it here, is questions end with a question mark, and they have kind of an up inflection. And questions are most definitely not speeches. And so what we'd like to have is just tell us who you are, give us your name, and if you have any sort of affiliation you wish to let us know, like you're from a certain college or a certain outfit, let us know that, and then ask our question, and we'd be happy to answer it. And we'll try to get around to everybody. And we also have, I think, perhaps some questions that are coming in from our online audience. So we have one back here already. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Grant Rostig. I mean, you mentioned Bitcoin. And you didn't mention gold and silver. So in terms of freedom with regard to preserving our personal pennies or wealth in physical form, perhaps, what do you think the trends are in the United States for the preservation of the right to own gold, silver, and perhaps even Bitcoin or something like that?
I think that they're good. Obviously, gold and silver have gained a lot of value with the economy that we're in. I don't see them going anywhere. But you'll find this interesting. Sometime in the 90s, I participated in a Liberty Fund group. Now, the Liberty Fund brings a bunch of scholars together for 3 days, and they read a common book, and they argue about it, right? But they're all fairly conservative or libertarian-leaning people. And the book we were reading was Leland Yeager's The Fluttering Veil. And basically, let's get away from paper money, something like that. After 3 days, a lot of the libertarians in there couldn't agree on anything that would be a good backup for paper money. We go from gold to platinum to a market basket of goods and back to and I left that conference going, well, you know what money is? Money is whatever you'll take. Money is whatever you put value in, and as long as you put value in the U.S. dollar, it's got value.
So to your question, in Texas, some foresighted lawmakers created the Texas Bullion Depository up in Leander to get our gold away from those Yankees in New York City and to put it where it needs to be in Texas. And there has been legislation in the last session. There's likely going to be legislation in the upcoming session that this foundation will back that will create a bullion-backed digital currency. And what's interesting about that is that any of you, if you wanted to, could buy gold and have it in your account with an app called Glint, which would have the gold stored in Switzerland. And you could go to Whataburger and you could buy a hamburger with gold. Now, they wouldn't know because you'd just be using your credit card. The problem is when you do that, the IRS considers that a selling of gold, and when you buy it, that's a purchase of gold, and so that would all be reportable for your taxes. It wouldn't, however, if the state of Texas adopted a digital, precious metal-backed currency, because the U.S. Constitution says that states cannot print paper money, but that they are allowed to use gold and silver as legal tender. And if it's legal tender, then it's none of the IRS's business what you're doing with it insofar as selling and buying it, right? And we're proposing this as a way of having a more resilient financial system in Texas, make it perhaps a little less profitable for a country like China to try to attack our currency, whether directly through cyber attacks or other financial means, as well as potential for disaster recovery if the communication systems go down. So it's just a good backup to have.
That reminds me, Chuck, that Benjamin Franklin, I think, told a story of how worthless the Continentals had become.
Right.
That he observed one man chasing down a creditor trying to pay him in paper dollars.
Right.
Come back here, you will take this money. And the Guy's running away from it.
Yeah, well, as you know, as a historian, the British counterfeited a lot of those, and after the war, they graciously agreed to accept the value of the Continentals because they valued the trade with us more than than trying to say, well, those are all the counterfeits that we made. Let's take a question from online here. I see. Yes, we have a couple of questions from online, our online viewers. And I think you've already partially answered this, is the rise in secularism related to globalism?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've seen this notion that there is God's not in charge, and your best source on this is Noah Yuval Harari. Just read his book *Sapiens*, and you'll kind of get an idea of where he wants to go with all this. He says things like the God of the Hebrew Bible only managed to create organic life, like giraffes and tomatoes and humans, but we can create inorganic life, like cyborgs and Terminators and things like that.
And that's superior.
Yeah. To him it is. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Let's take another question from online, and then we'll go to the audience. Is any politician or party around the world openly labeling themselves as globalists?
No, that's a good question. I don't think too many are. Of course, many very much are, but
they're not open about it.
They're not open about it because they do have to get elected in their home countries at some point.
Right. Right. Another question from. Yes.
I will take questions on rock and roll too.
Yeah, you gladly. Yes, I know.
Some have argued that with the end of globalism, that it may be super regionalism upcoming. Is that likely in your opinion, and is it advisable?
Yeah, that's Zehan's argument. Peter Zehan is one of the foremost, and he's not always right, but I think he's pretty much right on this, that there are these new regional conflicts developing in the Middle East, in Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan and these kind of areas over water, over obviously China and wanting Taiwan back. Parts of Latin America are having some of these conflicts. So you can't help but go in that direction. Is it advisable? I don't see how it can be any worse than what we went through in the last 30 years maybe with globalism.
Question right here. I think we have some people getting ready to ask questions over to our left. Clint?
What is your response to the counter-argument that world trade promotes economic advantages?
Oh, yeah, this is the Thomas Loopy Friedman argument that any two countries that have Dell computers or Starbucks won't go to war with each other. And of course, we proved that wrong when we invaded Iraq. And this is constantly, you've got all this fighting going on between countries that have roughly the same levels of technology and commerce and so forth. But this is nothing new. Churchill said this at the turn of the century, and of course there's Keynes's famous quotation, I can't remember it exactly, but it's, the Englishman can sit there at his desk and order tea from India and cotton from Egypt, and he goes through all these things and how wonderful it is. We will never have another global war, and that was written in 1901.
How about, though, going back, I think you also asked, though, about the benefits. Are there benefits to this sort of free exchange of goods?
Sure. I mean, obviously, you want to be able to trade on a fair basis with people, but that doesn't include something like China, which has a kind of stacked trading deck, and it can't commit a single nation like the U.S. to enforcing free trade for the whole rest of the world, because then we not only become the world policeman, but our taxpayers start paying the burden for the rest of the world. And this is how we got into a $32 trillion debt, was that we have been paying for the security of much of the rest of the world for about 50 years.
A portion of that debt. I'd argue that.
Well, there's Social Security.
You're right. That's a little more than half of that. But yes, it is a portion of it. We have questions over here to the left. I thought I saw some hands getting ready to come up. Did we answer all those questions? Oh, yes. Thank you.
I'm interested in learning more about George Soros. You said that 2 years ago he left Europe. Mm-hmm. Did he do that to focus only on our country, or what does he want? And I don't know. How do we fight against that?
The way I took the reading of their statements was that they had not succeeded in doing what they wanted to do in Europe, and that they weren't getting the reception they thought they were going to get. Now, here, of course, he kind of snuck up on a lot of people by funding all these DAs around the country, all these prosecutors who won't prosecute real crime but will throw patriots in jail at the drop of a hat. So I cannot figure out somebody like Soros. I mean, to me, he's just fundamentally evil, and I always put that in a spiritual realm. He's got spiritual problems, not psychological problems.
Any other questions? Because if we're done with questions, we may end up going to book signing.
Well, let me make just a couple of
Please.
announcements. You will have bookmarks out there if you get one. I have a full curriculum for high schoolers that goes with my Patriot's History of the United States, and it tracks it perfectly, and I teach every chapter in high production video. And that's where I'm headed after I'm done here, as I'm going to the Great Homeschool Convention out at the Kalahari Resort. The other thing is, we haven't talked much about the main book, The Patriot's History of the United States, but that book, I just sold Thomas my last copy here. That book is now in its 41st printing, 500,000 copies in print. And so I've just made available free a 20th anniversary update, which is the chapter that I wrote that goes from 2018 to 2023. And you can get that just by going to the Wild World of History, scrolling way, 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 way down, and sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get that chapter. You won't get the whole book. You got to buy the rest of the book, but I'll give you that chapter free, and I put in about 20 pages of new insertions of new material I found. Like, there's been amazing books written on World War II in the past 2 years. I thought World War II scholarship had kind of grown stale, but boy, this guy Ian Toll came out with a masterful trilogy on the Navy in World War II, and another guy, McManus, came out with a not quite as good, but a very good trilogy on the Army and the Pacific in World War II. So there's been a lot of new stuff since we finished our last edition, and I tried to put a lot of that in the update.
Nice. All right, going once, going twice for questions. Well, I think we'll see many of you outside, where you'll have an opportunity to have Professor Schweikart sign a book for you. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.